It was one of my first epiphanies, and it came from a number of different conversations. But this idea that I was seeing all these fights over prioritization and process, which goes with the prioritization problem. And then all these issues in churn and execution, right? Projects getting canceled halfway through, failing, succeeding, etc. And when I went to the root cause, it just was very simple that you had a bunch of very well-intentioned, very smart, ambitious people, but they weren't actually aligned on the strategy. They weren't aligned on the why, like what game they were playing. And so I use that euphemism because I went back to my high school experience. I played volleyball in high school. Volleyball is fundamentally a team sport. It really rewards coordination and different skill sets. Not everyone can do everything the same skill, but like you coordinate and you react to your competitor and how they're playing and that sort of thing. And so I really got like, why is this so much easier in sports than it is in business? Because in sports, you have this incredible clarity, what game you're playing, and you know how to keep score. And in business, that can be very vague. Good morning.
How are you?
Good morning, Adam.
You're looking fresh as ever.
Yeah, I just dropped off the kids at school, did my usual routine, managed to get the Starbucks, so I'm all here.
Oh, that's fantastic. So you're going to start off a little Starbucks and then work your way into a Diet Coke?
You may see the interview get higher energy as it progresses.
I brought my little,
I got
all over 6-ounce Diet Coke in your honor, man.
6-ounce Diet Coke, like in honor of when I was like 6.
Yeah, exactly.
And drank little things.
Exactly.
Are you a big Diet Coke drinker, Adam, still? Or is this a relic of your past with Joff here?
I mostly drink Diet Coke now when I'm out because at home, we have a bar fridge somewhere that has lots of stuff, but pretty much everything in the house is various forms of sparkling water or regular water. Usually I'm drinking water at home, but I do love Diet Coke. Still one of my most upvoted core answers.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
What is that?
Actually, it goes into kind of the differences between Diet Coke and Coke Zero and why Diet Coke outperforms Diet Pepsi and why Diet Coke ended up being such a unique accidental product.
There was also the great blog post that you put out on psychohistory. Was that?
Yeah, it's still there.
Yeah, so in psychohistory, I remember you put out a blog post on the Coke Freestyle machine. Do you remember that?
Yeah, back when the Coke Freestyle machine was new.
Yeah. You should explain.
They had it at venues.
Yeah, what is the Coke Freestyle machine? Let's start there.
I don't know if it wound up to be as big as you and I thought it would.
No, it could have been, Joff.
Yeah.
We just need to push a little harder. It was one of the things that got interrupted.
Oh, is that where you're going?
But yeah, for people who don't know, the Coke Freestyle, if you go still to this day, like you go to Five Guys or a movie theater,
right,
you probably see that Coke machine where you can pick all the syrups. There's 100-something combinations. And I thought it was great. And of course, at LinkedIn, at the time I was on the platform, it was one of the areas I was responsible for. And so I just got this exciting idea. I was always very passionate about facilities at LinkedIn. I know that sounds funny, but in company building, this actually goes back. When I was an intern at the Advanced Technology Group at Apple, there was a lab in a group that was focused on basically how space affects your work, right? Ambient information, right? They were doing experiments with what if you could just put web content up on the wall on a projector? What if you had lights that changed color? How does it affect your mood? How does it affect productivity? How does it affect innovation? And I was always very partial to this line of thinking that our environment affects how we think and work and the mood we're in. I still believe it to this day and like those innovations. I remember having one of these little orbs that came out in the 90s where it had a really limited API, but you could make it change colors based on if the stock market was up or down.
Right.
Or
yeah, I love that.
The ambient orb.
Yeah, the ambient
very
orb.
early
Exactly.
Boston startup. And actually the CEO of the first startup I ever worked at, Nabil Hyatt, was previously worked at Ambient Devices. So we talk about that thing, the orb, all the time.
So what that translated to is when I went to LinkedIn, it was still small enough and I was senior enough where there was a little bit of hand raising amongst executives like taking on problems. I remember Reed coming to me a few months in and saying, you seem to care about how people work and you care about engineering and you care about space. Like we need to build out a new floor. We had a new building in 2029. And so all of a sudden I ended up taking on this $750,000 project to build out space for 150 engineers and the downstairs. And that led to a lot of my theories about ice cream coolers and a bunch of other things we can talk about. But no, so the Coke Freestyle machine was one of these kind of things where we were moving to a new building. I was like, okay, what's special that could be in this building? We could have a Coke Freestyle machine. And best yet, I bet that thing has an API. And what if we could figure out what mixtures and drinks like tied to your LinkedIn ID based on your profession? Like, do the engineers drink, like, does front end drink differently than back end? What about people who've been there for a while? Product managers, growth versus features, right? Like revenue. And so I have these email threads with this team in Japan, which turned out to be the team responsible for the software for the Coke Freestyle. I discovered that it had a Verizon modem, actually did have an internet connection.
Wow.
I was trying to figure out how we could do some kind of hack day project to basically connect the LinkedIn identity to the Coke Freestyle choices and all of a sudden have this information about what actually people preferred, et cetera. Anyway, it was a funny thing, but every building space, I was convinced no one likes to move, and facilities are weirdly political and emotional for people. And eBay had a few little nice touches back in the day when I was there. They had soda machines. They weren't free, but they left one slot open so that each group could customize. I remember Salt Lake City, man, they had Pineapple Crush in their machine. And that was like...
Definitely Diet Coke. I hear Diet Coke is big in Utah, but
but anyway, yeah, exactly. The point is, the Freestyle machine was fun, although we never got that project finally landed. We did get the Coke Freestyle machine. I had to convince Coca-Cola, or I forget what group I had to convince, that actually the LinkedIn corporate campus was a big enough venue that it fit in their model of only doing venues. Like movie theaters and amusement parks. And I'm like, LinkedIn's like an amusement park. We have games and activities and hundreds of people. And anyway.
I think you and every like fraternity brother has thought about hacking that machine. Although I think your intents were more pure and healthier.
Yeah, I actually love the concept behind the Coke Freestyle machine. I really liked because this idea of it's so expensive to do brand extensions and do custom flavors. And so I think everyone focused on its configurability. To me, the data was just amazing. Of if you put this thing everywhere, I totally got this idea that you might discover regional variances. Maybe some people like orange flavors, maybe like raspberry. You might uncover things like, oh, I didn't really think about like mixing root beer with that. And why are people doing that? It also would allow you to adapt to trends a little better, see them ahead of time. Yeah. This goes back to eBay days. I always felt the magic of the eBay marketplace was that it was incredibly strong on both ends of the product life cycle for like retail products. Things that were new and hard to find, the eBay marketplace would see first. They'd see that demand, right? If there was a new PlayStation and no one could get it, that's something you auction off, etc. Or if it was really old and past end of life, where are you going to get an AC adapter for that old PowerBook, right? Like it was like eBay. And so you'd see these things for retro or old equipment or things coming back. And so I always had this bias towards systems that actually help you learn from the market rather than you pushing your ideas into the market. Yeah. Just as a check and balance to internal thinking, et cetera. And so I always thought the Coke Freestyle was actually an underutilized and actually a really interesting idea of there was probably some version of that would have made their entire supply chain and market and brand extension thing more efficient and more innovative than the other competitors. But I don't think they fully executed on that.
So if building out LinkedIn's office space was one of the first things that you did, and the Coke Freestyle was part of that, I absolutely need to touch base on one of the last things that you did at LinkedIn, Adam. And because every time I see you, I have to ask about this. I am going to bring up this Lego structure. So I'm going to put people back in time. So imagine it's about August 2011. Adam has had an incredible run at LinkedIn. I'm at LinkedIn. I sit across the way from Adam. And all of a sudden, what shows up in Adam's cube is the makings of the mother of all Lego pieces. And Adam has put in his mind that part of, I don't know if it was part of your legacy. I'll explain the story and then we have to come back to it. But I thought it was perhaps part of his legacy and a gift to the people of LinkedIn. He is going to build a 4 foot by 4 foot by 1 foot Lego structure with 10,000 pieces of Lego of the LinkedIn logo. And he is going to put it in the lobby of LinkedIn. But just watching Adam become the human 3D printer and assembling this thing, because at some point you start to realize you're like, holy crap, this thing is an astounding number of pieces. It actually takes real engineering and it's going to weigh a shitload. I don't know, but he had masterminded this whole thing. It was just crazy. But
you saw me rip it apart a couple of times to fix some structural flaws. But yeah, actually that Lego sculpture captures so many things. Like we were talking about the spaces. One of my passions is how people come together to build things. That includes organizations and that. So space, culture, all these things tied together. Where did Hack Days at LinkedIn came from? When I built out that first space, I was like, we should immerse ourselves in our product and our data. I'm going to put up screens all across the building, but they're going to be backed by a computer where people can push apps that display data. And it's going to be this open system where any team can push up a cool app. But you and I both know that when you build platforms, if you just say build it and they will come, it doesn't work.
Yeah.
And so to launch it, we had a contest, which was the first Hack Day over the holiday break, of teams competing to build these apps. And so the LinkedIn Lego was actually a version of this for me as well, which was actually, believe it or not, that came from a little bit of, I don't want to say a little competitive spirit, but it turned out my commute to LinkedIn at the time, very short, but did pass the Google Android garden. And I love the Google Android garden. So Google used to have this garden, this place where for every release of Android, they had a code name with the letters of the alphabet. And they'd build this statue to launch it.
Yeah, different robots and stuff. Yeah.
And this is the kind of culture stuff that I love, right? Celebrating releases, them out, like a little bit of history making. I love myth making, right? Like new employees come in and I'm going to work on one of those someday, or a release that makes I love that kind of stuff, because I do believe when you create organizations and cultures, there's a little bit of myth making and history you're building as well too. And that's true of all societal kind of structures and groups. But yeah, the LinkedIn Lego was part of this thing where I passed that Android garden and I was like, for a really high class, like geek culture, like Google, and Google's an engineering company, or at least it really was in its early founding ethos, et cetera. Larry and Sergey, the early team. I knew a lot of those folks. So I was like, what a miss. They built those statues. They just built them. They didn't build them out of Legos. Like, how do you miss? Obviously, all those Android sculptures would be better if they were made of Lego.
Yeah, built by the team, right?
Argument, right? I don't even understand. So I was like, Web 2 had a little bit of a chip on its shoulder versus Web 1.0, like going to do it better this time. Every generation is going to do it better this time. So I was like, Web 1 companies, sure, they build sculptures. Web 2, we make them out of Lego. And so I got this idea we were doing for Hack Day. And I was actually, the original impetus there was that it's actually very cool. The software back then, this is more than a dozen years ago, but there really had been progress in kind of modeling software to kind of auto-generate from 2D and 3D shapes into kind of Lego. There was some open source stuff floating around. And there was an interesting path where some people were experimenting with kind of 3D printing algorithms. So you're not wrong, Joff. So I remember digging into all this stuff to figure out how to generate this thing. And I had this whole model built out. Actually, my son, who was like 7 at the time, he's now in college, but he actually came in and we came in on the weekends. We did a lot of weekend work building this thing out, but it wasn't intended to be just a gift, a memento, but it was meant to have an anchor culture. So when I left, I was actually very happy to have it there. And we turned it into a time machine, right? At the IPO, we all put in these cards about what we thought would happen to LinkedIn in 10 years. And actually I went back a few years ago, Ryan had me back, and I had to open that thing up, which was not easy. And by the way, I'm amazed, earthquake country, et cetera, that it survived this long. I guess the platform, I built this whole platform for it, but emptied all the cards to look at what they predicted. And 2 of them did predict that it would be acquired by Microsoft.
Really?
A few hundred cards.
Oh, shit. Because I've asked you this before. Like, I really want to know what was on my card. And
did you sign it? I guess you could find it. Ryan has all the cards. They're all over there.
Ryan has the cards? Okay, cool. Yeah. I'm going to go find.
But actually, they put more stuff in it, and then I went back to fix the roof, so it's actually back for another 10 years.
Oh, they reset it with a new time capsule.
Yeah. I'm not sure I really anchored the Lego culture there. I feel like I won the t-shirt battle. There's still a lot of t-shirts around LinkedIn. Yeah. But yeah, the Lego thing, I wasn't there long enough to anchor that, because I still see things around campus not built in Lego. And I'm like,
it's funny.
Like, why would you do that?
That whole community building thing is really interesting, because I do remember someone would swing by your desk and be like, "Where's Adam?" And I'm like, I don't know. It wasn't my turn to watch them. And then they'd look and they'd be like, what's this? And I'm like, that's the Lego struct. Like, that's the mother of all Legos. And they're like,
LinkedIn Lego.
can I add a couple pieces? And I'm like, yeah, there's like another 8,000. Yeah, go for it. And they would like smack a couple pieces on and then just carry on and go on their way.
My favorite part of that project at the time, the operational. It's so funny when you dig into any problem.
Yeah.
It's amazing. Like you get that if you have the right mindset and you're learning and growing, you learn a lot from it, etc. But I remember discovering, like, I was trying to source all these Lego pieces and then discovering that the Lego website maxed out at 999 pieces of a certain type, and it was hard to coordinate. I think we ended up faxing an order to Denmark to actually get the scale of pieces that we needed. Yeah. And by the way, it turns out Lego did not care that much about the project we were doing, even though I think they could have made something.
Exactly.
Anyway,
exactly. They would care now when they saw what happened to LinkedIn. They'd be all over it.
I think there's an interesting lesson in this. I think you said it, which is that any project of meaningful complexity turns out to be 10 times more complex than you ever thought in ways that you can't even imagine. And product building is I think there's so much value in this. This is the second conversation I've had this week about just finding anything. It doesn't even have to be related to what you're doing and saying, I'm going to do this hard thing. And then trying to figure out what step one is, but not having to know what all the steps along the way are. I just heard a conversation with Tom Preston-Werner, who's the founder of GitHub, talking about his side projects. And one of them, I won't get into it, but was this Sonos thing where he wanted to use physical cards to play music. And it's the same exact thing where it's it's this simple idea, but it turns out this doesn't work and that doesn't work. And I had to build this thing. And then I had to learn how to do this electronics thing to make it happen. And just so much value in just building anything, even a Lego structure, and how much you learn about supply chain along the way. It's pretty cool.
I think it gets to some of the original reasons that people fall in love with engineering in the first place. Disney had this movie that almost no one watched at the time because it was that awkward phase, but when Disney Animation was not sure what it was going to do, and Pixar had risen up and they're figuring it out. But it was called Meet the Robinsons, I think.
Okay.
And actually, it's a great movie. By the way, if you haven't watched it with your kids or that sort of thing, it captures that kind of Disney Imagineering ethos. See a problem, fix a problem, that idea you fail over and over again, right? And until you solve the problem. It has a lot of that fun stuff to it. It even has a time travel plot, which is surprisingly clever.
Yeah, that's come a long way for Disney because they used to always start with a parent getting killed, right? Like Nemo and Cinderella and Bambi. So yeah,
I feel like you're taking that a little personally. I don't. It's not you. It's okay. But no, I really like that. I think it's just truly the product. I still have from that Lego thing. I still have sitting somewhere plans for super easy open source project would be to build a website that probably thousands of people would love, where you can upload any image, extrude it to 3D, or upload a 3D model, and it would roughly spit out, here are the pieces you need to buy, kind of auto order them, and some instructions on how to do it. That's a fun thing where instead of kids being trapped into the store-bought exactly ones, it's more open for fun things to do. But yeah, we'll put that in the list of projects that never got to scale. And
Adam, were you always just a crazy geek?
Yeah, I don't know. I just had a lot of different interests. But yeah, always this tension. By the way, it ended up playing out in my career. Always this tension between kind of math and science, the rational kind of rules-based systems, and understanding and exploring and experimentation. And then the creative process on design. If you found me as a kid, yes, I'd be reading all this math, et cetera, but I'd also be super excited that for my birthday, I got a new set of pastels or charcoals, or a new marker set. And I think that, you mentioned my blog earlier, and obviously that became known for a lot of the product posts and other things I wrote about and still write about. But yeah, for me, that tension, psychohistory, right, is this. The reason I picked that name is I love this idea of, in my career and the things I focused on, this combination of the rational, which can sometimes be technology, right? Human computer interaction, the computers turned out pretty rational. We'll see how AI goes, and maybe less rational as things go on, but pretty rational. Finance, money, dollars and cents, very rational, economics, etc. And then you have humans, which are fundamentally irrational and have these other motivations and ways of evaluating things. And I've just always been fascinated by how they come together. Yeah. The intersections, where there's friction, where there's amplification. So
I would love to talk about the blog for a little bit, because I think you were probably, I don't know if you were the first, but probably one of the first people to be writing publicly on the internet about topics about growth and product management. And certainly I was an early reader. I probably learned a ton from you building my career around that. And I remember there being, those three topics: personal finance, which obviously became a big piece of your career with Wealthfront and now Daffy; growth and product management stuff around things you were learning, I think, at LinkedIn and other places, and then some of the psychology sort of pieces as well. And it seems like product management, even writing, has really professionalized as the discipline has professionalized. And I'm curious what you've seen change in terms of the ways people are writing about it. And I'm also curious about your motivations early on. Like, what inspired you to just share? Because some of this stuff looked like secrets, honestly, to somebody on the outside of it.
Oh, actually, that's great. Actually, I think my blog was certainly not one of the first blogs out there, et cetera. And actually, my current blog, even though it's as old as it is, almost 20 years, was actually my third attempt at blogging, going back to the 90s. Of the internet, for me, it goes back to college. One of the magic things you discovered when I went to college at the time was you got this internet connection. All of a sudden, I discovered everything from news groups, file transfer, all these other things. But this idea of knowledge sharing, of the idea that if you had a programming problem, you'd post on a news group and someone said, you don't want to use those APIs, use these ones. This is all before Stack Overflow on the web and GitHub and Copilot and all this other stuff. But so to me, what happened with my blog was that it was very authentic to just where I was, which is I had been an engineer. I had moved into product at my first startup in the late 90s. I was one of the early employees and I moved from engineering to product. But there was no definition of what product was, really. And the guy I worked for, who was wonderful and gave me the opportunity, a guy named Mark Johnson, he had come up to Apple, and Apple didn't have a product role, right? Apple is this older kind of, it's a hardware company, and its DNA originally had more of the traditional like marketing rights and MRD. And then engineering and design rip that apart and come up with a response, and then you sync, and then you go and build. So I went to business school, a little burnt out on the whole 90s thing, and took some classes there, but never felt like they had really had a beat on how modern software was getting built or how teams got together. My best model for that work were companies like Microsoft, which was one of the first pure software companies, not the first pure software company. And they had done this program manager, kind of product manager split. And even if you pushed in, you also had the engineering manager, and that was interesting. But after I was in venture capital for a couple of years after business school, I ended up going to eBay. And so eBay was really my first modern web product job. And I started as a product manager. I wasn't even a senior product manager. I was just a product manager. This is why to this day on careers, I talk about embracing the ups and downs and learning new things. But eBay was one of the few companies at the time that was growing. The talent was amazing. And it was actually one of the first companies in that era that was just very data driven, right, which I found really appealing. And I remember joining there. And so I remember learning a lot about product along the way. And then what happened with Web 2.0 is it became like more people were writing about stuff. And I said, I'm going to share what I'm learning, because the thing that drove me crazy in my first product role is that there was no framework. There was just no system. There was no these are the three things you do as a product manager. Like, you'll be held accountable for these. This is how you're doing a good job or a bad job or an okay job. They had the HR systems and they had some equivalent of OKRs, and all that other machinery was going on. And by the way, it was amazing. eBay was an amazingly process-oriented company. The CTO at the time, who had been the head of product, came out of more of a consulting background. And so every project was prioritized, resourced, had an NPV. There was a whole team that orchestrated who got assigned to what. It was like incredible from an efficiency and predictability standpoint. But the product outcomes weren't always great. I'm being generous there. And so a lot of what you saw in my early blog was me trying to figure out, okay, this, on the one hand, this seems like a great system. Like, this company is super successful. The product is hitting records and numbers and doing really good things. And yet it seems like we also aren't solving certain problems. Why? And so you had this iteration on my blog too. If you look at my early posts, you can almost see this formulation. And then you see me go to LinkedIn. I go, okay, we're going to do it better this time. We learned a lot from Web 1.0. And we did. Actually, we did do a lot of things better than the Web 1.0 generation. And so you see more of those product posts. And then you get this added boost in my blog where I suddenly discovered that actually you could have a dozen internal meetings and not actually convince anyone of anything, right? It's just the way these things work. But if I wrote a blog post publicly, it really did shape the conversation. And I don't mean that in a political thing. I actually cited to the fact that when you write something down, the level of clarity you have to have,
right,
and the clarity of your thinking, the clarity of expression, we're just very sloppy in day-to-day meetings and interactions, right? We don't have we didn't put the same thought into what we're saying. We don't try to tighten the frameworks up. We don't challenge them in the same ways. I just actually, in a funny way, the writing on the blog was partially for clarify my own thinking. And then what I discovered is once I wrote these posts, etc., it was much easier for me as a manager and a leader, one, to communicate to my teams as it grew how I thought about things. To this day, like my new current company, Daffy, we have a very writing-oriented culture. Alejandro, one of my favorite engineers from LinkedIn back in the day.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
And my co-founder, we both agree, right? Like forcing every right. So like when a new employee starts at Daffy, we just had a new employee start last week. What do I ask them to do? I asked them to go through, because we use Notion right now. I asked them to go through and I have them read the original seed memo that I wrote for our seed round, right? I have them read every 6 months. I write and update a strategy document for the company that outlines the whole thesis, what we're doing, what we learned in the last 6 months, what our priorities are going to be for the next 12, what metrics we're going to judge ourselves by, and then how that translates into the roadmap we're going to pursue. But I think the blog was the beginning of that epiphany for me that writing is not just for, this is the problem I think with the current professionalized space, is that it's almost infused too much of the media orientation. I think a lot of people are writing about product and leadership kind of the way a lot of business books have been done for decades, or sometimes you see this out of academia occasionally in the business world, right? In business school, et cetera. Is this really the way that you do things, you think is the better way to do things, or is just a way for you to build a reputation and you every year you're brainstorming, what am I going to put out this year and speak to on the conference circuit? And not that there's anything wrong with that. I just think that I don't want to show too much hubris around it or too much pride. But when I look back at some of those product posts, the thing that strikes me is not, they weren't really to build reputation. I don't think they were effective at really building reputation per se, although they had some carry-on effects, knock-on effects. It was authentic, right? I wrote about after growth was so stressful, building that out at LinkedIn, people don't remember companies didn't have growth teams. eBay had user acquisition, and by the way, Jeff Hausenbold did some inspirational things there, and eBay building out Triton and programmatic ad buying and all these things. That was actually the beginning of a lot of what became 20 years of innovation around performance-based advertising. But LinkedIn, Facebook, right? This idea that no, actually the future of distribution was actually going to be designed into the product and had to be authentically in the product. And that meant engineers were building it, which means it was more of an engineering design product function and less of a pure marketing function or idea function or brand function. And so we had this massive unbundling actually of marketing at the time. And so my post in the original about virality, Joff knows Elliot Schmuckler, who I'd moved over from Profile to
I worked with
Growth.
Elliot.
And Elliot's fantastic. And he came up with a bunch of amazing, interesting frameworks to look at things. And so some of my blogging was basically literally what I had learned in the process. By the way, even to this day on virality, my original post where I talk about basically the equivalent of you're spending too much time thinking about branching, inviting more people, and not thinking enough about cycle time, about how fast the viral cycle.
I will just say, this was, when I think of your blog, I think of rabbits. I think of that cycle time post. It made a huge difference in the way I thought about virality as well, and what the problems in one of the products, a social game I was working on at that time was. And we actually thought about it as, okay, how do I get those invites?
You were at Zynga?
Yeah, I was at Zynga for about 2 years, but we came out of a startup that was acquired by Zynga. And so we were trying to figure out what other people were doing well and why it works. And like cycle time ends up being like a light bulb for you. It's not just are people sharing, but are your new users acquiring new users within the first day or two of their time on site, because that's what really drives exponential growth. And so I always think rabbits, not something else.
Yeah, you're referring to the fact that I had a joke in there, which is that rabbits make lots of rabbits, not because the litters are so big, but because of how frequently they reproduce.
Yeah.
But that's my point, is a lot of those posts, I think the reason why they stood the test of time and people still refer to them, even though it's more than a decade later for some of them, is that they were authentic to my learning process. And they are literally the lessons that I found useful. And by the way, at every role, Joff, you had sent me some ideas and notes earlier, but when I was thinking, even when I was at Wealthfront, I remember having to explain, like at a new company, post Web 2.0, more mobile era, et cetera, how do you explain the role of product? Because engineers and designers are always skeptical that product needs to exist.
Right.
That's my old joke, is that product is a role that's constantly questioned and destroyed and then re-evolves because actually the fundamental drivers for the product role are evergreen and part of the fundamental problem of teams building software. But like at Wealthfront, I remember writing this post that I added to kind of my docket, where I talked about lessons from the creative world, the value of editorial and the value of curation, right? And this idea of, for example, an editor, that you can think of whatever famous author you're thinking of, right? They might even be like, they might be the best-selling author, etc. You've never heard of their editor. But if you talk to that author, they will usually tell you that their writing benefited tremendously from having an editor, right? And even though they're not the famous author, that editor adds a lot of value. And in some ways, there's lessons there for product roles. And I think in general for executive leadership, of that difference between you're not the author, but there's value to be providing as an editor, right? From the outside, looking with a clean pair of eyes. And I was saying curation was the other one, which was, if you think about an art display or a museum or et cetera, right? If you're doing a show on I don't know, whatever, but whatever style you're doing it, you can do it. It's fine to say like, look, that's an amazing piece. It just doesn't belong in this show. This show is about this, right? That thematic thing. And I always feel that's important because engineering tends to be fundamentally a discipline that rewards bottoms up organization, decoupling, decomposition, small independent teams. But design, and to some extent product, because it borrows from it, benefits from editorial and curation. Right. It benefits a lot from a top down point of view. And a lot of the struggle in software is just trying to solve that paradox of engineering fundamentally benefiting from small, iterative, decoupled, independent action, and design and product really benefiting from top-down editorial and curation.
I'd love to dive into that a little bit, because one of the things that we're seeing recently, Brex released a post about how they build product, which is really focused around really what looks like a shift away from the trends that you and I were involved in building around growth teams, et cetera, around bottoms up, towards a small number of larger releases that are much more focused across the year. We also saw Airbnb famously do this with their summer and winter releases, that they change around their product process about a year ago, I think maybe almost 2 years ago. And it seems to be a shift. And I'm curious about whether you think this is a good model for teams to emulate or not, because I will say personally, my initial reaction was, this is nuts. Everything we've learned about product is ship fast, iterate quickly, empower end teams to be relatively independent, especially around growth type work, right? Of fast iteration, cycle time matters in product building too, not just in virality, right? And I'm curious your thoughts on this, because I've been surprised by it, but it's starting to pick up steam. You hear Linear talk about how they build Brex now, Airbnb and others shifting towards this different model, like that, like looks more like an Apple, like couple of releases a year. I'm just curious from your perspective, whether you think this is a good idea for especially startups to emulate.
No, it's not a good idea for startups to emulate, but I don't think Brex is really a startup anymore at the scale they're at, et cetera. See, I think part of the problem we get into, and it's an evergreen problem in this industry, and it makes it feel a little cyclical and almost like fashion between how we run these teams and software, et cetera, is we keep fishing for this one size fits all solution. Like, this is the right way to do it. And the reality is the organization you have, the process you build, how you think about prioritization, it all comes back to the strategy, which gets to the heart of what type of business are you building an organization? Who are your customers? What is the strategy? What is the market rewarding? I will tell you from my roots, I ended up landing at Apple. I worked on web objects, but I ended up landing in the larger Rhapsody team, absorbed all of that, which was the code name for what became macOS 10 and all the OSs now that Apple has. Actually, Craig Federighi is still there. But fundamentally, when you work on an operating system, you're not iterating and pushing things out. Actually, Apple, if you talk to Craig now, like he actually left Apple. He was the CTO of Ariba during that whole boom, and he actually came back. And part of the reason Apple now ships their operating system every year is part of his desire to pull in more of that move quicker, iterative kind of project cycle in there. But no one wants their OS, right, radically changing that often. Think of all the things that you have to do. If you have training and customer support, right, like having a product that changes all the time makes it very hard for them to support the product. your customers, if they're building business process over it. I remember at eBay, there was a huge moment where eBay realized that actually they were, by the way, in modern terms, eBay didn't feel like it shipped so fast, but at the time, eBay shipped every week. It alternated between kind of an infrastructure release and a feature release. So every 2 weeks for features. But if you're an e-commerce seller and half your business is basically how you do in Q4, guess what you don't want to have happen? All these new features and all these things to change. You're trying to run thousands of listings, all this product, fulfillment, shipping, et cetera. And so I remember when eBay realized that actually, no, we're going to have a bigger release for sellers and package it all together in September. And then we're going to not change it out from under them. I mean, we'll fix bugs and that sort of thing. And so I actually think that when I read these posts, some of it says to me, what market are they in and what gets rewarded? Right. What do their customers really benefit from? What are the tensions? But I will say, I agree with you for part of the disconnect for me, and I always get nervous with these kind of solutions, is it is a size and a scaling problem. No matter how great Jeff Bezos is or whoever your favorite kind of founder or leader is that's scaled to amazing size, there are flaws with kind of top-down orchestration, right? There's flaws with innovation. There's flaws with being that distant from your customers and the data. And yes, I know it's wonderful for every member of the executive team to be out in the field and talking to real customers and really data, but the reality is like you get big enough and big enough scope, there's no way for that to happen on a one-off basis, right? No matter who is president of the United States, right? There's a giant field of organizations and teams that have to be out there to actually get information. The Federal Reserve, we might talk about the chair, but there's a big organization there collecting data all around the country on a bunch of economic statistics to make their decisions better. And so when I look at these things, I like that actually people are asking these questions. I would prefer it if they tied it more to the strategy at the moment. Yeah. If they said more, hey, for the next 3 years, what we need to be great at this company is A, B, and C. And so the only way we're going to do that is with more orchestration, more harmonization. We've got this big customer base. I like the focus on simplicity, although I think that term gets overused in terms of what it means. This idea that your customers can only absorb so much in messaging and context. I still think of game mechanics, by the way. I love gaming. There's only so complex you can make the game where before the customer kind of goes, I don't even know what you want me to do. What's rewarded, what I'm supposed to be doing. And so I would prefer more of the narrative of saying, given what we need to be great at for the next few years, this is the right way to run, because it'll establish the inevitable flexibility that I guarantee you, software is a competitive business. None of these things are easy. It's very likely that in 2 to 3 years, the organization will have to orient around a different set of problems and bottlenecks that have orchestrated. And if you make it too religious on the way you function, it makes it hard for the organization then to change.
That really resonates with me because going back to Reed, I remember him sharing with me that any company is going to have several founding moments. Yeah. And in those founding moments, you're not just resetting talent, but you're looking at the system that you're building, the shipyard, and you're saying, okay, what do I need to produce these products moving forward? And it's no surprise that things change. I think a lot of the Brex and the Airbnb stories is looking at where they are in their growth cycle and saying, hey, they went from early stage startup, finding product market fit, getting into finding go-to-market machinery, getting that built out. And they're much more tenured and larger organizations. It feels like there's a spectrum between, because I remember the old eBay model, and I wasn't part of it like you were, Adam, but I always remember thinking about it as, I get it, there's a train and everyone has to get on the train track or not, and you were either on the train or you want. So it was like this, it was a singular thing that was running through, and that feels like the Brex announcement. But on the other end of the spectrum is what I remember in that amazing cultural document that Netflix put out, one of the points that they make is, you want to be a system that's loosely coupled and tightly aligned. And I felt that LinkedIn did a pretty good job at that, where we focused on what's the global optima that we're focused on. That's going to be the strategy that has to filter down into all of the different business units. But those business units need the autonomy to work on their own and to solve it. So there'll be a central unifying structure in the global optima, but then let people just go off and do their work which is pretty different from that other model where, to Adam's point, you're very top down and you're saying, I'm going to have a single editor or single curator. It always feels like it's a little bit of that Steve Jobs thing where it's, look, we're going to be very tight in what comes out of the system.
Yeah. The way I like to think about this is like, you have to have process product fit, if that makes sense, which is you're building a particular product. And this is what stresses me out about the cargo culting around these like processes. Cause I think it's really, does my product that I'm building and my customer base and the way that what they are expecting match my process? So it's, for instance, when we started working with enterprise customers, we had to learn all the lessons Adam was talking about. Like we moved some basic UI on the growth team and had a random salesperson was like, what are you doing? You can't do this. You can't just change it. And I was like, wait, why? And did you know that they have 300 pages of Slack training documentation and you just without telling anyone changed it? And now 20 customers have to go change all that stuff. And so you start to learn about this stuff that like we have, I don't know if it's process product fit or process customer fit. There's this like product process market fit. I don't know what we want to brand it if we would write a blog post about it, but I think it's important. And so something I've learned is that as I work with companies on these things is let's talk about what's important for your product. So like linear, of course, simplicity is important. Their whole positioning is on, no offense, Joff, it's simplicity versus Jira or Confluent or other products. And so it's, okay, let's build the system for that. The thing that I worry about in this is I worry that what these processes are optimized towards is founder control and like CEO obsessiveness, which is a good thing to have. And I'm not begrudging it, but that it is serving the internal desires of the organization versus the customer needs of the organization. And I think that's where it gets scary is, are we serving but there is process culture fit too. So it's a little tricky. I don't know. It's a complicated problem.
Yeah, it all ties together. But like I said, I think I feel actually lucky in some ways, and this is going to totally date me. It's fine, safe space. But I actually feel very fortunate that I came up in the desktop software era before the web fully immersed, because I do think there's this fundamental tension between what the web rewards for both kind of an engineering process, product design, et cetera, versus a more packaged product. And so I think people, what I've noticed, and you see this in the older cultures at Apple, Microsoft, et cetera, I talked about operating systems, but even back in the day, like this idea of major releases, minor releases, bug fixes, the dot releases. This is I still use that language. This feel like even the whole team this year, I'm like, we're not ready to do 2.0 of the product, but this is feel like a 1.5. We've actually learned a lot now and we have a lot of data. Like we can do a better version. And so I think that from a product perspective, that idea of that editorial curation of what's going to be in Photoshop 4, we lost that on the web. And actually some of that was good because we got data, we got better feedback. I remember having this eye-opening meeting. I forget whether it was Windows 7 or Windows 8. I think it was Windows 8. I was at Greylock at the time, and they were pitching what they were going to do with Windows 8 and push out. And at the time, I was asking, what data is this based on? I was immersed in the web, and you must have all this incredible data. And I had forgotten, like in the desktop era, they still were like, are people using the ribbon or not? It was like user research. They were out there just watching.
Is this computer even connected to the internet? Probably not.
Which, by the way, the anthropology, the user research has value, but it's a different type of value. And so I do feel like we got some of it back with the app economy in the last 10, 15 years, right? People realize, like I'm using this app. What does it do? Why am I opening this? I have 30 seconds. What am I doing with this app? This tension between kind of what I'll call web product culture and more kind of coherent, app culture is almost another evergreen problem. And that's why I get back to, I like your thing around process product fit or process strategy fit. This is why the number one problem I always see with these things is if you don't really clarify tightly for the team what game you're playing and how to keep score, which I think are the essential
pieces. I explain that to people, Adam, because that's a great, you have it out on a post, but it's worth hearing.
I do. It was one of my first epiphanies, and it came from a number of different conversations, but this idea that I was seeing all these fights over prioritization and process, which goes with the prioritization problem. And then all these issues in churn and execution, right? Projects getting canceled halfway through, failing, succeeding, et cetera. And when I went to the root cause, it just was very simple that you had a bunch of very well-intentioned, very smart, ambitious people, but they weren't actually aligned on the strategy. They weren't aligned on the why, like what game they were playing. And so I use that euphemism because I went back to my high school experience. I played volleyball in high school. Volleyball is fundamentally a team sport. It really rewards coordination and different skill sets. Not everyone can do everything the same skill, but like you coordinate and you react to your competitor and how they're playing and that sort of thing. And so I really got like, why is this so much easier in sports than it is in business? Because in sports, you have this incredible clarity, what game you're playing, and you know how to keep score. And in business, that can be very vague. And by the way, the smarter people are, the more they come up with their own rationale, right? You have 5 smart people on a team. Don't be surprised if you come up with 7 different games you could be playing that might be interesting and how to win at those games. And so I realized that from a leadership perspective, and I did push a lot of that on product. That was the moment I started talking about product leadership instead of product management, because it's not unique to product. But as a leader, in the end, if you don't tell your team what game you're playing and how to keep score, you are going to get endless churn and fighting about prioritization. You're going to get endless churn and fighting about process. And you are going to have a lot of execution failures. And it's all going to be because everyone is playing a different game, even within a product team. Even like you'll have engineers on the same team and designers not playing the same game, right? Not optimizing for the same goal. And so to me, that was the epiphany that led to that post that really anchored a lot of kind of my product guidance, which was number one job is not prioritization. Number one job is not execution. Number one job at first is to make sure that everyone knows what game you're playing and how to keep score. That's the product strategy. If you do the product strategy well, then all of a sudden prioritization and process becomes very much like what's the best path to succeeding at that strategy. And then once you prioritize, you've broken things up. Now your execution. Now every piece. See, I've always liked systems where every piece rolls up coherently to the top. Like even if they're independent and acting independently, there has to be some way of orchestrating all that behavior,
I think
all that energy, all that intelligence. And so I like systems that organize around strategy and data, basically.
Yeah, I would say that post, if there's one post that's mandatory on psychometry, I would start with that one and then just look at the list of articles and dive in from there. It reminded me, Adam, because after that post, years afterwards, Jeff Weiner, who is the CEO and an amazing leader, really popularized this concept of vision to values, which different words, but I think the construct is very similar to what Adam is saying. And when we were at Yahoo, because I was over at Yahoo, Jeff was over there, Ryan was over there. There's a lot of LinkedIn people that were over at Yahoo. And some of your greatest learnings come from failure. And the failure at Yahoo was after the portal game, we couldn't decide what game we were going to play. And we watched social go by, we watched search go by, we watched Netflix and YouTube go by. So it was like literally there were these other waves that were following where the wave that we were on, the portal wave, was dying. And it was exactly what Adam said. It was like we had different leaders throughout the organization at the EVP level who had very different opinions around what Yahoo should be. So when Jeff went over to LinkedIn, he was very adamant that we were clear about what the vision was for the company. Our vision was to bring economic opportunity to every member of the global workforce. And from that, we would have strategies. Strategies are how you navigate the competitive landscape. Those strategies were going to be measured by OKRs. Those were going to be proximity goals that get us closer to the strategy. But I think you're right. People who they go through failures like that, they're so adamant about what is the game that you're playing and communicating it over and over and over again. That was another learning from Jeff's run at LinkedIn.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's funny you say this, but this is what I love about software is I feel because of technology constantly opening up markets, you have this ongoing froth of always new startups, new approaches, going after old markets, going after new markets. And every generation of company, there's some cycle, 3, 5, 7 years. We kind of anchor and we go, we're going to do it better this time. And I really viscerally feel that. Like I felt like the web was a reaction to the desktop era. I felt like Web 2.0 was a reaction to what worked and didn't work in Web 1. Like we solved a lot of problems, but we caused some new ones and we figured that out, the mobile era. And so it's funny, like you're talking about Yahoo and the things learned there and eBay. And I just love that energy because I do think that we learn, and unfortunately, sometimes we regress. We forget some things, like Fareed, you were talking about.
Yeah.
Like, I do think we forgot some things from the desktop era that actually we had to rediscover during the mobile era, and I still think we're rediscovering some things. But I feel like I keep learning. This is one of the reasons I keep doing stuff. Is I feel like every year I learn new things.